Welcome to today's Explainer. We're looking at a deeply tense, honestly kind of uncomfortable intersection in astrology today. It's what happens when romance directly collides with rules, regulations, and our daily routines. You know, when we think of Venus, we usually picture poetry, flowers, and grand romantic gestures, right? But the source text we're analyzing paints a drastically different picture. We're going to look at what the predictions say about Venus in the sixth house. It's a placement that basically forces us to look at the unglamorous mechanics of how relationships actually function in the real world.
So, think about the question we're posing. What happens when romance requires a contract? It feels almost contradictory, doesn't it? I mean, we all want our romantic lives to be boundless and free. But today's source material really forces us to confront this highly unromantic reality of mixing our deepest emotional ties with cold, hard practicalities. How on earth do you quantify affection? How do you regulate a partnership? This is absolutely crucial to the core conflict we're exploring today. It's about that friction that happens when the boundless nature of love gets shoved into the rigid boxes of legal and financial obligation.
Okay, let's dive into this. The predictions surrounding Venus in the sixth house define it as a placement where love and emotional ties are heavily influenced by labor, routine, and legalities. Think of it like a giant crucible. It's this specific environment where the idealized fairy tale version of romance is completely stripped away, and it just violently collides with everyday obligations. So we aren't talking about the honeymoon phase here, we are talking about the reality of paying bills, managing a household, literally doing the laundry, and ensuring that the legal scaffolding of your life is actually secure.
To really grasp the inherent tension we're talking about, we have to look at this stark contrast. On one side, we've got emotional ties and love, fluid, subjective, totally driven by feeling. But on the other side, we have formal disputes in law, rigid, objective, driven by written contracts. Our source predictions indicate that under this specific placement, these two totally opposite forces don't just sit nicely side by side. No, they actively bleed into one another. You simply cannot easily separate how you feel about someone from the formal agreements you share with them.
Moving into our first section, love meets law and labor. Let's look at this as a bit of a cautionary tale. Now, what's really interesting here is how incredibly blunt the source material is. It says, legal matters may involve partnerships or emotional ties. This is a direct warning. When love and law collide, the emotional investment complicates the legal reality big time. If you find yourself in a legal situation under this influence, the text suggests it likely isn't going to be some sterile, business-only affair. The dispute, or whatever legal matter is at hand, is deeply entangled with someone you have or had a profound emotional connection with. And that emotional weight, it makes navigating the legalities incredibly heavy. This brings us to Section 2, Romance in the Workplace, and the tricky business of professional boundaries.
Let's look at the first specific battleground mentioned in the predictions. It's an environment where labor and relationships naturally intersect literally every single day. The workplace. The source explicitly warns that workplace relationships may face tension over money matters. When you blur professional boundaries with romance, you're inviting a very unique kind of friction. I mean, it's one thing to have a disagreement with a colleague about a project budget, right? It's an entirely different beast when that colleague is also your partner. The text points out that in this environment, financial issues like salaries, promotions, shared business expenses become the primary catalyst for relational tension. The professional and the personal become dangerously intertwined.
Let's transition to Section 3, Shared Wealth and Imbalance. We're looking at financial expectations here.
We're shifting our focus from the office desk to the shared bank account, and this brilliantly illustrates exactly why merging lives can be so perilous, especially for cohabitating couples. The text makes two interconnected predictions here. First, shared resources can become a source of conflict. Second, financial expectations may not be clearly communicated. Unspoken assumptions about money are basically a breeding ground for resentment. Imagine one person assumes shared resources mean equal spending power, and the other assumes it means proportional contribution based on income, and neither of them actually says it out loud? Well, that is a total recipe for disaster. The lack of communication turns shared wealth into a weapon.
Which leads us directly to this somewhat grim reality. The source predicts that financial disagreements can lead to legal complications. There's a real touch of irony here, isn't there? You fall in love, you decide to move in together, you sign a lease, and suddenly, bam, you're bound by property law. There is absolutely nothing romantic about fighting over who is legally responsible for breaking a shared lease or dividing up a joint savings account. But the text shows a direct, predictable pipeline here. A failure to communicate financial expectations leads to financial disagreement, which in turn escalates directly into a legal headache.
Which brings us to Section 4, the trap of dependency.
where we get into some thorny contractual issues.
Let's soften our tone for a second and look at the emotional root of these practical issues. What actually happens when the fundamental balance is lost in a partnership? Well, the source groups these concepts together for a reason. First, love relationships may experience imbalance leading to disputes. But more critically, dependency in relationships can create contractual issues. This is a really profound point from our text. Emotional or financial reliance isn't just a personal, private issue under this transit. It actively morphs into a tangible contractual liability. If one partner is entirely dependent on the other, the unspoken contract of the relationship is totally skewed. When that skewed relationship tries to navigate the real world of leases, loans, or shared assets, the underlying dependency turns formal contracts into traps rather than protections.
All right, moving on to Section 5, escaping the legal fallout and how we can actually go about protecting these relationships.
We've kind of reached the climax of our cautionary tale here. We really need to take a sharp, serious look at the ultimate fallout when these relational and financial boundaries entirely collapse. I want to emphasize the gravity of this line from the source material. Relationship issues may escalate into formal disputes. We are no longer talking about minor tiffs over who left the lights on, or even private arguments about budgeting. The word formal is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. The prediction indicates that without proper boundaries and communication, personal relationship issues will literally spill over into the public, regulated sphere of formal mediation, legal action, or contractual severance.
So the crucial point is how we synthesize the antidotes implied by our source material. Based on the warnings we've just unpacked, the exact steps needed to protect a relationship are actually quite clear. Step 1. You absolutely must actively communicate financial expectations. You cannot leave things to assumption. Step 2. You must bring legal clarity to your agreements. If you're sharing resources or entering a business arrangement with a partner, treat it with the seriousness of a legal contract. Why? Because eventually it might be judged as one.
Let's move to the next point and see how this builds directly into a critical piece of advice from the text. Agreements may need legal clarity to avoid misunderstandings. Reread that carefully. Getting things in writing, being incredibly specific about who owns what and who owes what, isn't a sign that you don't trust your partner. Actually, according to these predictions, it's the exact boundary needed to prevent the misunderstandings that destroy relationships in the first place. Getting the legalities clear might actually be the very thing that saves the romance in the long run.
Which leaves us with this final thought. Look at your own life. Do your romantic partnerships have clear enough boundaries to survive a sixth house transit? Have you had those unromantic, highly practical conversations about labor, law, and shared resources? The predictions we've explored today suggest that relying on love alone simply isn't enough when the bills come due and the contracts need signing. It's a lot to think about for sure, so do your relationship contracts need a second look?